In today's video, we're covering the most horrific snake attacks ever recorded, from a reptile stepping into the enclosure of his python during her shedding cycle to a volunteer handling one of the most venomous pit vipers in North America.
December 3rd, 2013 brought the worst ice storm in decades to the mountains of North Carolina, with freezing rain coating everything in a treacherous layer of ice. By evening, temperatures had plummeted to well below freezing, and the rural areas around Asheville were locked in a crystalline grip that snapped power lines and left thousands without electricity. Snake Steve Morrison was dealing with the severe power outage at his rural breeding facility, watching nervously as the temperature continued to drop, and his backup heating system strained against the bitter cold. At 52, Steve had been breeding native venomous species for 22 years, supplying educational institutions and zoos throughout the Southeast with specimens for research and educational programs. He was considered an expert on southeastern venomous snakes and lived alone on his remote mountain property. Steve had invested heavily in backup systems to protect his animals during emergencies, understanding the critical nature of maintaining proper temperatures for his cold-blooded charges. His facility included backup generators, battery-powered heating systems, and emergency protocols designed to keep his animals alive during power outages and other emergencies. During the ice storm that knocked out power, Steve brought a small generator into his attached garage to power essential heating systems for his snakes. The decision seemed logical. His animals' lives depended on maintaining proper temperatures, and the generator could provide the necessary electricity to keep critical heating systems running. However, Steve underestimated the ventilation requirements for safe generator operation in an enclosed space. The attached garage, sealed against the winter cold, began filling with carbon monoxide as the generator ran continuously. The colorless, odorless gas accumulated steadily as Steve worked frantically to maintain his animals' life support systems, unaware that he was slowly poisoning himself with each breath. Carbon monoxide is particularly insidious because it binds to hemoglobin more readily than oxygen, gradually reducing the body's ability to carry oxygen to vital organs. As CO2 levels rose throughout the evening, Steve became increasingly disoriented and failed to notice that vibrations from the generator had loosened a cage latch, allowing a 4-foot timber rattlesnake to escape onto the garage floor. The constant vibration from the running generator had gradually worked the latch mechanism loose, a failure that Steve would have immediately noticed under normal circumstances. The escaped timber rattlesnake represented one of the most dangerous species in Steve's collection. Also known as the canebrake rattlesnake in some regions, timber rattlesnakes are among the most formidable venomous snakes in North America. These heavy-bodied pit vipers can grow up to 6 feet in length and possess potent venom that combines both hemotoxic and neurotoxic properties, causing tissue destruction, blood clotting disorders, and nervous system damage that can be fatal if left untreated. Timber rattlesnakes are known for their generally docile nature compared to other rattlesnake species, often remaining motionless and relying on their excellent camouflage when threatened. Their coloration provides perfect camouflage among fallen leaves and forest debris. However, timber rattlesnakes will strike defensively when stepped on, cornered, or directly contacted. Their venom yield is substantial. A single bite can inject 100 to 150 milligrams of venom, with as little as 100 milligrams potentially fatal to an adult human. These snakes are ambush predators that can remain motionless for hours or even days while waiting for prey to come within striking range. Their heat-sensing pit organs allow them to detect warm-blooded animals with remarkable precision, even in complete darkness. When they do strike, their speed is explosive, They can extend their bodies nearly their full length in a fraction of a second. In his severely impaired state from carbon monoxide poisoning, Steve didn't see the snake coiled on the floor near his workbench and stepped directly onto it while checking equipment connections. The timber rattlesnake's response was purely defensive, a quick strike to the perceived threat followed by an immediate retreat to a defensive coil. The bite delivered a substantial dose of venom into Steve's ankle, penetrating deep into the tissue and immediately beginning the process of tissue destruction and systemic toxicity. Under normal circumstances, Steve would have immediately recognized the severity of the situation and implemented his well-rehearsed emergency protocols. However, the carbon monoxide poisoning had severely impaired his cognitive function, preventing him from thinking clearly about the protocols he had followed successfully over 2 decades. Steve became confused about the bite's significance and delayed calling for help. The combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and timber rattlesnake envenomation created a deadly synergy that attacked multiple organ systems simultaneously. The CO2 prevented his blood from carrying oxygen effectively, while the snake's venom caused additional respiratory depression and cardiac complications. Steve lost consciousness sometime after midnight, never realizing that his emergency solution had become his death trap. Emergency responders found him the next morning after neighbors reported concerns about generator exhaust visible from his property. The timber rattlesnake was discovered coiled peacefully in a corner of the garage, having returned to its preferred hiding behavior after the defensive strike. The incident led to mandatory carbon monoxide detector requirements for backup power systems in reptile facilities, and served as a sobering reminder that even emergency situations can create cascading failures that turn life-saving equipment into deadly hazards. Steve's death demonstrated how emergency situations can impair judgment and create dangerous conditions that experienced professionals might not anticipate. It was September 18, 2014, in the rural farmlands of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The morning air was warm but not yet oppressive, and the sugarcane field stood tall and still under a pale sky. It was the kind of day where work moved steadily and without incident, until a moment of misjudgment changed its course. Thabo Ntembu was 34, a field assistant working for a regional herpetology research project that specialized in venomous snakes. He had been with the program for 4 years, valued for his knowledge of the land and his ability to navigate both farmland and the wild scrub beyond it. Thabo was not formally trained in science, but he was quick to learn, often trusted to assist with field measurements, GPS logging, and photographic records. He took pride in the role, seeing it as a bridge between his rural upbringing and formal research work. This trip had taken him and a senior researcher to a series of smallholder farms where sugarcane bordered patches of native grassland. They were documenting snake activity during the warmer months when sightings increased. Thabo's personal goal was to add to the project's growing library of photographs, images that help with identification and educational outreach. Though aware of the dangers, he believed that proximity and quick reflexes could make for better, clearer images, a mindset shaped by years of working close to animals. The dirt paths between the cane fields were narrow, hemmed in by walls of green stalks that rose over 8 feet high. Dry leaves littered the ground, rustling faintly in the light wind. Beyond the fields lay patches of bush where thorn trees cast narrow shadows. The stillness of the morning was broken only by the hum of insects and the occasional call of birds overhead. Visibility was limited. Anything moving at ground level could vanish into cover within seconds. Black mambas are among the quickest and most dangerous snakes in the world, capable of reaching speeds over 12 miles per hour in short bursts. They can grow longer than 14 feet and are known for their potent neurotoxic venom, which can cause respiratory failure within hours if untreated. While generally avoiding human contact, they can become highly defensive when threatened, raising the front third of their bodies and delivering multiple rapid strikes. Their warning and open black mouth is as distinctive as it is brief. Earlier that week, local farmers had mentioned mamba sightings near the outer cane rows, warning the researchers to keep to the central paths and avoid dense grass. That morning, the senior researcher reminded Thabo to maintain distance and not to block a snake's path, as most would retreat if given space. These words came back only minutes before the encounter. While crossing a narrow track, the two men saw movement ahead, a large dark shape gliding from one side of the path to the other. Thabo was holding the camera. The mamba's size and visibility against the pale dirt was exactly the sort of image he wanted. Ignoring the instruction to hold back, he stepped forward, angling himself so the snake would have to pause before entering the far grass. The senior researcher called for him to stop, but Thabo was already crouching slightly, lifting the camera to his eye. The mamba reacted instantly. It turned toward him, the front third of its body rising until its head was level with its waist. The mouth opened wide, showing the black interior. Then it struck, 2 rapid bites to his lower torso, followed by a third to the upper thigh. The entire attack lasted less than 2 seconds. The snake then dropped back to the ground and slid into the grass, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. Thabo stepped backward, dropping the camera to hang from its strap. His left hand went to his side, where the fabric of his shirt was already marked by 2 small punctures. The senior researcher reached him in seconds, guiding him down to sit and pulling out the bandage for pressure immobilization. He radioed for their driver, who was stationed a quarter-mile away, and began wrapping Thabo's leg as well. Within minutes, Thabo's speech slurred and his eyelids grew heavy. His breathing became shallow and he struggled to keep his head upright. They carried him to the vehicle and laid him in the back seat. On the dirt road toward the highway, the senior researcher monitored his pulse, which was rapid but weakening. By the time they reached the main road, Thabo had lost consciousness. The clinic in the nearest town was 12 miles away, but the vehicle was still 3 miles short when his breathing stopped. CPR was attempted while continuing the drive, but there was no response. At the clinic, he was pronounced dead on arrival. The estimated time from bite to death was under 40 minutes. His funeral was held in his home village 3 days later. Fellow researchers attended, standing alongside family and friends in a small outdoor service. The coffin was simple, carried by relatives from the church to the burial site. The project director later spoke privately with the family, expressing that Thabo's contributions to the research were valued and that his death underscored the risks inherent in the work. Within a week, local environmental authorities installed signs at key points along the sugarcane fields warning of mamba crossings. Farmers adjusted their harvest schedules to avoid certain times of day, when snake activity was highest. It was May 24, 2013, outside San Antonio, Texas. The spring evening was still and heavy with heat, the kind that lingered after the sun had dropped. In a weathered shed at the back of a rural property, a retired man struggled with an animal he had raised for years. The situation would escalate slowly, then violently, until it left him lifeless on the ground. Harold Duncan was 61 years old, a retired machinist who had spent much of his later life in seclusion. Widowed and with few close friends, he poured his energy into an unusual pursuit, keeping large snakes. He had built a series of makeshift enclosures in his shed, reinforced with plywood, wire, and chains. Neighbors knew him only in passing, remarking on the occasional smell of rodents or the faint hiss that carried on quiet nights. Among reptile enthusiasts, he was less known, but those who had visited described him as dedicated, methodical, and proud of his collection. The centerpiece of his animals was a Burmese python he had acquired as a juvenile nearly 2 decades earlier. By 2013, the snake measured over 20 feet and weighed more than 200 pounds. Duncan often boasted privately to relatives that the python was calm and accustomed to his presence. Burmese pythons are among the largest snakes in the world, capable of growing over 20 feet and exerting immense constriction pressure. Their bodies are built for ambush predation, wrapping prey and tightening with every exhalation until circulation and breathing cease. Though not venomous, their power alone makes them capable of killing a human in minutes. In captivity, they may appear tame, but their instincts remain unchanged. Even long-term owners face sudden shifts in behavior, especially during feeding or when the animal feels confined. He rarely asked for help handling it, insisting he could manage the animal on his own. His habits were consistent: feeding frozen rabbits, cleaning the enclosure monthly, and repairing the aging structure when needed. That spring, one of the cage latches had broken. Rather than leave the snake contained and call for assistance, Duncan decided to move it himself to another holding area. Relatives had urged Duncan not to handle the python alone, pointing out his age and declining strength. Local authorities responding to previous calls about the snakes had noted the inadequate housing but stopped short of seizing the animal. A neighbor recalled hearing odd thuds and muffled calls from the shed earlier that evening, but assumed it was routine. But when Duncan's niece stopped by to drop off groceries and found the shed door ajar, she discovered him inside already entangled. The python had coiled around Duncan's lower body, pinning his legs together with bands of muscle. His face was dark red, his breath shallow and broken. He could only force out a few gasps before falling silent. Each attempt to push the animal away only caused it to cinch tighter. The shed echoed with the scrape of wood as Duncan stumbled back against the wall, dragging the massive reptile with him. The coils rose higher, locking around his abdomen and chest. He dropped to the floor under the weight, his arms pinned awkwardly against his side. His niece later told deputies she heard a faint groan and then nothing more as his chest compressed. The sound of ribs giving way was faint but distinct. She screamed for help, running to the road to flag passing drivers. The python shifted again, wrapping around his neck and head, leaving only muffled grunts beneath its tightening grip. Duncan's movement slowed, his body jerking weakly as his airway collapsed. When deputies and animal control arrived minutes later, the scene was grim. The snake held Duncan flat against the floor, its coil spread across his torso and face, eyes fixed forward. The officers attempted to pry it off, but the pressure was immovable. Finally, one officer raised a shotgun and fired into the snake's body. The coil slackened gradually, the massive animal thrashing weakly before falling still. Duncan lay beneath it, unresponsive. His chest collapsed inward from the crushing force. Paramedics confirm he had suffered massive internal injuries and cardiac arrest, declaring him dead at the scene. In the days that followed, the property was cleared of the remaining snakes, most smaller but still exotic. Authorities cited the unsafe enclosures and lack of proper permits, though no charges were filed posthumously. His funeral was modest. attended by a handful of relatives and 2 former co-workers. There were no eulogies beyond a brief statement from a cousin about his quiet life. Among neighbors, the reaction was muted, with a few expressing relief that the snakes were gone.
It was May 2nd, 2018, when the air over the Cross River felt heavy and still. Mina Balogan was 19 years old and had just returned from university 1 week earlier. She spent most of her afternoons at the river. People knew Mina for her lively personality. She often brought her cousins to swim with her, even though the older people in the village warned them that snakes were more active during the dry season. Mina didn't think their warnings were important. She believed that nothing dangerous ever happened in the shallow water. On this day, she convinced 4 of her cousins to join her for a swim. They left their sandals and shirts on the rocks before walking into the cool water. Mina had plans to go back to school soon. She talked about wanting to start a small community project when she returned, something that would teach younger children how to swim safely. She had always thought of the river as a place full of life, not danger. Because Mina felt so comfortable in the water, her cousins trusted her and followed her without worry. The afternoon was the kind where every sound seemed to carry far. The river's surface looked calm and reflected the cloudless sky, but local people often said the water was never truly quiet. Something was always moving underneath. The part of the river they chose was wide and shallow, with muddy banks that fishermen liked to use. The air was humid, and dragonflies flew just above the water's surface. Even though it was a bright day, the thick plants on the other side of the river made long shadows over the deeper parts of the water. African rock pythons are the biggest snakes on the continent. They can grow to be more than 20 feet long. These snakes hunt by staying very still until an animal comes close. Then they bite with powerful jaws before wrapping their body around their prey to squeeze it until it stops breathing. While attacks on people are rare, these snakes are known to catch and eat goats, dogs, and even large animals like antelopes. During the dry season, they often hunt near water sources that are getting smaller because that's where animals come to drink. Earlier that week, an older fisherman had warned Mina's uncle that he had seen a very large python lying in the sun on a log nearby. Children had been told not to swim until the rains came and made the water levels higher, but Mina insisted that the shallow bend where they swam was safe. Mina had been in the water for almost an hour, playing and floating on her back, when one of her cousins saw something long and dark moving toward them. At first, they thought it was just a tree branch caught in the current, but when it curved and moved silently across the water's surface, fear spread through the group of children. The shape moved forward quickly, showing the patterned body of an enormous python. The snake attacked with shocking speed. Its jaws locked onto Mina's side before its body wrapped around her. Her cousin screamed as the snake's coils got tighter, forcing the air out of her lungs. The water became violent and choppy as Mina fought against the snake, then went still as the python dragged her into deeper water. The children ran as fast as they could back to the village, screaming for help. It took several minutes for the men to grab their long knives and run to the river. By the time they got to the river bend, the snake was still moving around in the water but had pulled Mina deeper under. The men went into the water and cut at the python over and over until it finally let her go. When they pulled her onto the muddy riverbank, she had clearly been underwater for several minutes. Her skin was cold and pale, and her lips were a deep blue color. The villagers tried pressing on her chest and blowing air into her mouth, while others stood back in shocked silence. When they pressed on her chest, water came out of her mouth and nose, and mixed with the mud under her head. Someone recorded the desperate scene with a phone. The sound of shouting and rushing water mixed with the noise of long knives hitting the snake's body. Their efforts continued for several minutes, but there was no sign that she was breathing. Mina's body was placed on a mat near the water as the villagers gathered in silence. For weeks afterward, the river bend remained empty. Fishermen refused to throw their nets there, calling the area cursed. The village learned that even familiar places could hide unexpected dangers, especially during times when wild animals were more likely to come near human areas looking for water and food. Mina's dream of teaching children to swim safely took on new meaning as the community worked to prevent similar tragedies from happening again.
The evening of June 15, 2014 brought oppressive humidity to Gainesville, Florida, with temperatures still hovering near 85 degrees even as the sun began to set. The thick, sweltering air made even routine tasks feel more laborious, and the climate-controlled reptile facilities offered welcome relief from the stifling heat outside. Robert Bob Hendricks was conducting his routine evening feeding at his specialized python facility, taking advantage of the cooler evening hours when his animals were most active. At 43, Bob had built an impeccable reputation over 18 years of breeding large constrictors, supplying his specimens to zoos and research facilities across the Southeast. His colleagues knew him for his meticulous safety protocols and deep understanding of giant snake behavior. He had never had a serious incident in his entire career. At 9:45 p.m., Bob was preparing to feed his most impressive specimen, an 18-foot, 180-pound female Burmese python he had raised from a hatchling over 8 years. These serpents represent the pinnacle of constrictor evolution, capable of growing over 20 feet in length and weighing more than 200 pounds in exceptional cases. Burmese pythons are among the most powerful constrictors in the world, with muscular bodies perfectly designed for overpowering large prey through sheer crushing force. The Burmese python's hunting strategy is a masterpiece of predatory efficiency. These massive snakes are ambush predators that can remain motionless for days while waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Their heat-sensing abilities allow them to detect warm-blooded prey from remarkable distances, while their incredible strength enables them to overpower animals as large as deer, wild boar, and even alligators in their native Southeast Asia habitat. When a Burmese python strikes, the attack is devastatingly effective. They don't just constrict around their prey, they position their coils with mechanical precision, applying pressure that can exceed 90 pounds per square inch. These apex predators possess incredible strength that allows them to overpower prey much larger than themselves. A large Burmese python can exert enough constricting force to crush bones and compress vital organs, while their stamina allows them to maintain this pressure for extended periods. Their feeding response, once triggered, is relentless and methodical. They will not release their grip until they are certain their prey is completely subdued. This particular female was in peak condition, her body thick and muscular from years of proper care and feeding. She had been fasting for 4 weeks in preparation for breeding season, making her extremely food-motivated and responsive to feeding cues. Well-conditioned Burmese pythons in feeding mode are among the most dangerous animals to work with, as their predatory instincts are heightened and their strike response is lightning fast. Bob had been preparing to feed her a large rabbit using his standard safety protocols, feeding tongs, secure barriers, and maintaining safe distances at all times. However, as he maneuvered the prey item toward the feeding chamber, the rabbit slipped from his tongs and landed just inside the enclosure opening. Instead of using backup tongs or waiting for the snake to settle, Bob made a split-second decision that violated his own safety rules. Believing he could quickly retrieve the rabbit before the python could react, Bob reached into the enclosure with his bare hand. The moment his arm crossed the threshold, the python's predatory instincts were triggered. The massive python struck with explosive speed, her jaws clamping down on Bob's forearm with crushing force. Her backward curved teeth, each nearly an inch long, sank deep into his flesh and locked him in place. Before Bob could react or call for help, 180 pounds of pure muscle began wrapping around his arm and torso with mechanical precision. The snake's primitive brain had identified him as a threat or potential prey, and her constricting response was now fully activated. Each time Bob struggled or tried to pull away, the python's grip tightened automatically, her powerful muscles responding to his movements by increasing pressure. Bob's attempts to call for help were cut short as the python's grip tightened around his chest, making it impossible to draw a full breath. The snake's muscular coils responded to his struggles by constricting further. Each movement he made triggered an even tighter grip. His ribs began to compress under the tremendous force, and his vision started to darken as oxygen deprivation took hold. The constriction was methodical and relentless. Bob's consciousness faded as the python's coils compressed his chest and restricted blood flow to his brain. The snake maintained her grip for over 17 minutes after he stopped moving, her primitive instincts ensuring that her perceived prey was completely neutralized. Only when she was certain there was no threat did she begin to slowly release her coils and retreat to the back of her enclosure. Bob's assistant found him the next morning when she arrived for the daily feeding rounds. The python was coiled peacefully in her favorite hiding spot, showing no signs of agitation or stress. Bob's body bore the unmistakable marks of constriction, compressed ribs, restricted breathing passages, and the deep puncture wounds where the snake's teeth had initially grabbed him. The investigation revealed that Bob had violated multiple safety protocols in his attempt to quickly retrieve the dropped prey item. His death served as a stark reminder that large constrictors, regardless of their normal temperament or years of conditioning, remain powerful predators whose instincts can be triggered by the slightest provocation during feeding situations. It was June 21, 2015, in Nakhon Si Thammarat Province, Thailand. The air was thick from a storm that had rolled through an hour earlier, leaving puddles in the dirt and a faint smell of wet earth. The overcast sky dimmed the daylight, and in the low light of the snake shed, movements inside the cages seemed sharper, more deliberate. Somchai Phan, who had made a career out of handling dangerous reptiles, was about to break one of the first rules he used to teach beginners. Never clean a venomous snake's enclosure without removing the animal. Somchai was 36, the son of a rice farmer who had turned his fascination with snakes into a livelihood. Over the past 12 years, he had supplied local reptile parks with cobras, vipers, and pythons, earning a reputation for being both skilled and fearless. He lived with his wife and young daughter in a small house behind his breeding facility. Though careful with most of his animals, he believed his 13-foot king cobra, raised from a hatchling, recognized him. It was his most prized specimen, and he often showed it off to friends, demonstrating what he called its calm nature. On that afternoon, he had invited 2 locals to see the snake. His assistant, familiar with its moods, advised against working inside the enclosure while the cobra remained in it. Somchai dismissed the concern, saying the storm's cooler air would make the animal sluggish. The cobra lay stretched along the far wall of its pen, its head elevated slightly, tongue flicking. Somchai entered with a bucket and a rag, intending to replace the water bowl and wipe down the floor. The shed was built from corrugated metal, the walls lined with wooden enclosures. Rain dripped steadily from the roof edges outside, and the air carried the damp organic smell of reptile bedding. The cobra's pen was 6 feet deep with a clear acrylic front panel, giving the friends a direct view of the animal's movements. The dim light made its scales glint a muted olive, broken by pale bands on its hood. King cobras, the largest venomous snakes in the world, can reach over 18 feet and weigh up to 20 pounds. They can deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an elephant. Unlike many snakes, they'll hold their ground and can rear up to a third of their body length, striking from a distance that surprises even experienced handlers. Cooler temperatures often make them more alert rather than sluggish, and storms can heighten their defensive responses. The first warning came when the snake's head lifted higher, hood widening as Somchai reached toward the water bowl. His friends saw the body shift, muscles tightening in subtle waves. Somchai tapped lightly at the hood with the back of his hand, a demonstration he had done before. The cobra's strike was almost silent, a blur covering the 3-foot gap. Its fangs sank deep into his left forearm. Somchai jerked back, clutching his arm but laughing in what appeared to be bravado. He told the onlookers he knew how to handle a bite, even as 2 puncture wounds welled blood down his wrist. His assistant grabbed a cloth, tying it tightly above the elbow while attempting mouth suction, a method widely known to be ineffective. Within 90 seconds, Sumchai's voice thickened, and he swayed on his feet. His pupils narrowed, and his breathing grew shallow. The two friends helped lower him to the floor, his machete for cleaning still lying near the enclosure door. The Cobra remained in the pen, hood still spread, watching the movement outside its glass front. Starting the 40-minute drive to the nearest hospital. 5 minutes into the trip, his limbs went limp and his breathing became faint, punctuated by brief gasps. The assistant attempted mouth-to-mouth resuscitation while the truck sped along the narrow road. By the time they reached the hospital gates, Sumchai's chest had stopped moving. Medical staff attempted to ventilate him, but the neurotoxin had already paralyzed his respiratory muscles. He was pronounced dead within minutes of arrival. Back at the facility, authorities arrived to secure the Cobra and other venomous snakes. The king cobra, still coiled in the same spot, was removed under strict containment protocols. The rest of the snakes were confiscated, citing improper safety measures and the risk to the surrounding community. Sumchai's funeral was held the next day in the village temple, attended by family, friends, and several local park operators who had worked with him over the years. His assistant spoke briefly about the dangers of overconfidence, noting that Sumchai had taught others to respect the unpredictability of snakes, but had forgotten that lesson himself in the moment. The incident prompted a short-lived discussion among local authorities about licensing and safety standards for private venomous snake keepers, though no formal changes were made. It was July 14, 2016 in Dayton, Ohio. The summer heat lingered into the evening, pressing against the quiet neighborhood as porch lights flickered on. In one of the modest two-story homes, the basement had been converted into a reptile room. That night, what was supposed to be routine maintenance of an enclosure ended in violence that could not be undone. Kelly Hammond was 38, a retail worker who had developed a reputation in her community for her fascination with snakes. Friends described her as steady and methodical, someone who spent most of her spare time caring for her collection. Over the years, she had accumulated more than a dozen pythons, Burmese and reticulated among them. It wasn't a casual hobby. Her basement contained heating systems, stacked glass enclosures, and feeding logs written in careful handwriting. Though she lacked formal training, she had immersed herself in books, online forums, and reptile shows. Neighbors sometimes saw her outside, a massive snake draped around her shoulders while she adjusted it with practiced movements. To her, the animals were not dangerous pets, but a challenge to manage responsibly. That night, her goal was simple: clean the enclosure of her largest reticulated python, a 16-foot specimen weighing over 120 pounds. She had handled it dozens of times before, confident that her familiarity and grip were enough. She invited a close friend to assist, partly to capture the routine on camera for her collection. It was a decision made casually, one that felt safe because it had always gone without incident. Reticulated pythons are the longest snakes in the world, with adults often exceeding 15 feet in captivity. Though non-venomous, they kill by constriction, tightening each coil every time their prey exhales. Their bodies are pure muscle, able to exert crushing pressure strong enough to crack ribs or stop circulation within minutes. Captive specimens retain the same hunting instincts as their wild counterparts, responding quickly to movement and body heat. Warnings existed. Local animal control had reminded reptile owners of the risks after prior incidents in Ohio, including fatal constrictions in private homes. Herpetologists caution against handling large pythons alone or without proper safety tools like hooks or barriers. Hammond had read these advisories but often felt they overstated the danger. She trusted her experience, having draped the snake around her shoulders countless times. That evening, her friend asked if it was safe to stand close with the camera. Hammond reassured her, saying the animal was used to handling. At first, the snake slid from her arms with slow, heavy movements. Hammond shifted its bolt carefully, trying to guide it into a temporary container while she cleaned. Then, in a sudden shift, the animal coiled upward, looping around Hammond's torso. Her arms were pinned against her sides, her balance tipping backward. At first, her friend thought it was part of the demonstration. Hammond had often shown how strong the python was, letting it cling to her before gently unwinding it. But this time the coils tightened sharply, each contraction pushing deeper into her chest. She managed to say she couldn't breathe, her voice broken and strained. The python's head angled upward, pressing against her neck. Hammond staggered and fell hard onto the floor, the weight of the snake driving into her ribs. Her friend dropped the camera and tried to pry at the coils, but they didn't move. The snake's body tightened rhythmically, each exhale met with a squeeze. The sound of ribs cracking broke through the struggle, described later as a sharp snap like dry wood splitting. Hammond screamed once, then the air left her body in a shudder. Her face flushed red, then purple, as the python's body worked higher, circling her shoulders and jaw. The bulk of the animal covered her chest and head, muffling any further sound. Her friend pulled and shouted for help, but the weight and strength of the snake were impossible to overcome. A neighbor who heard the cries went in and saw the situation. He immediately called animal control. Minutes stretched as she went still, her body pinned under the shifting coils. By the time animal control arrived, Hammond was unresponsive. The python had loosened slightly, its body resting heavy across her torso. Removing it required multiple officers, each pulling to unwind the coils one by one. And by the time she was free, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Her body showed deep bruises along the chest and back, broken ribs, and severe compression injuries. Her funeral in Dayton was small, attended by family and a handful of fellow reptile enthusiasts. The service was quiet, reflecting her life more than her death. Local authorities seized her remaining snakes, relocating them to licensed facilities under tighter supervision. Ohio's Department of Agriculture reviewed private ownership laws for large constrictors, citing the case as evidence that stricter enforcement was necessary.
It was September 9th, 2015, in a small lime orchard outside a rural town near Veracruz, Mexico. Jorge Cruz was 42 years old and had worked in this lime orchard his whole life. He got up before sunrise every day to check the water systems, cut tree branches, and teach his oldest son how to tell if the fruit was healthy or sick. People in the village knew Jorge as someone they could count on. He was the type of person who would fix broken carts for his neighbors and lend them tools without expecting anything back. Jorge had a habit from when he was a child. He liked to work without shoes. He said this helped him feel the ground better and move faster when he had to climb the lower tree branches. The afternoon was very hot, and the air felt heavy. The sun beat down on the leaves so hard that nothing seemed to move. This orchard had belonged to the same family for many years. On this particular day, the normal work routine would be interrupted by something that changed everything in just one moment. Jorge was working with two neighbors, Raul and Mateo. They were picking limes on the far side of the grove where workers had made a pile of cut tree branches after cleaning the area recently. The three men were making jokes about how hot it was as they moved between the low tree branches, putting bunches of limes into bags. Jorge was wearing his wide hat pushed back on his head and an old, faded shirt. He reached for a low branch and shifted his weight to pull the fruit closer to him. The ground in the orchard was hard dirt covered with cut leaves and thin roots. The pile of cut branches provided cool shade for mice, rats, and small reptiles. There was a patch of wild plants that marked the edge of the orchard, and the low treetops made long shadows that moved across the ground. It was very quiet, so small sounds like fruit falling to the ground or clothes rubbing against tree bark were easy to hear. The men were focused on their work and conversation, not paying attention to potential dangers around them. A type of poisonous snake called the Terciopelo, Bothrops asper, locally known as the nauyaka, lives in Central America. These snakes are thick-bodied and usually grow to be 3 to 5 feet long. They have very dangerous poison that destroys skin and muscle, causes severe bleeding in the area where they bite, and can affect blood clotting and blood pressure throughout the body. These snakes blend in perfectly with fallen leaves and often stay completely still until someone steps close to them. When they bite someone, it usually causes extreme pain and the area swells up very quickly. That morning, neighbors had been talking about seeing more snakes since the recent rains. Jorge's wife had told him to wear boots while cleaning brush and debris. The pile of cut branches where they were working was a temporary heap of trimmings, exactly the kind of place where snakes like to hide. Raul later said he had warned Jorge to be careful, but Jorge waved off their concerns and said he would work quickly. When Jorge shifted his position, the snake attack happened instantly. The fer-de-lance burst out from the leaves and bit the skin just above his ankle. Raul and Mateo heard Jorge make a short, sharp cry of pain and saw him pull his foot back while grabbing at the wound. Before the other men could react, the snake bit him a second time. Dark blood spotted the dirt where his foot had been. The pain hit Jorge immediately and was very severe. He bent over double and dropped the fruit he was holding. Within just a few minutes, his lower leg began to swell and the skin started to look bruised and discolored. He began throwing up and sweating heavily, and his face became very pale. Raul quickly tied a piece of cloth above the bite marks, and they kept Jorge's leg still by making a splint from a broom handle. A neighbor brought a small wooden cart, and they lifted Jorge into it, then pushed the cart toward the dirt road that led back to the village. The trip to the clinic was bumpy and slow. Dust covered Jorge's damp skin, and he became confused, speaking in broken words and going in and out of consciousness. At the small village clinic, a nurse looked at his swollen leg and noticed that his pulse was weak and his blood pressure was low. The clinic had basic medical supplies but no anti-venom, the special medicine needed to treat snake bites. The staff used their radio to call the regional health center asking for help, but the nearest supply of anti-venom and a properly equipped ambulance was hours away. Jorge's condition got worse. He became more and more disoriented, and his breathing became shallow. The medical staff could not help him get better. By evening, Jorge had died at the clinic despite their efforts to stop the bleeding and help him breathe. Raul said they tried to kill the snake, but it disappeared into the thick plants. Jorge's flip phone and work notebook were found and returned to his family, though they were stained. In the weeks that followed, a traveling veterinarian came to the village. He brought a small supply of anti-venom and taught basic training to local people who could respond to emergencies. He showed them how to make splints from available materials, how to apply pressure bandages, and explained when not to use tourniquets. The villagers cleaned up and clearly marked the brush pile area. They put up a simple pole marker where Jorge had been bitten. His wife began wearing his wide-brimmed hat during harvest times, a visible reminder of his absence. The lime trees continued to produce fruit, and from that time forward, each harvest season began with a brief, serious reminder to all workers about being careful and staying safe.
August 11, 2015 brought scorching heat to Tucson, Arizona, with temperatures soaring past 110 degrees by mid-afternoon. The desert sun beat down mercilessly, making the climate-controlled research facility a welcome refuge from the brutal heat outside. Dr. Patricia Pat Williams was conducting routine maintenance at her private research facility, grateful for the air conditioning that kept her workspace at a comfortable temperature while the desert baked outside. At 45, Dr. Williams held a PhD in herpetology and operated a licensed facility that bred native venomous snakes for educational purposes. She had been working with venomous species for 15 years and was considered an expert on southwestern reptiles. She had been bitten twice before during her career, both times by copperheads, with minimal effects beyond standard localized symptoms. These previous incidents had followed typical patterns for copperhead envenomation: localized pain, swelling, and tissue damage that resolved with appropriate medical treatment. Her experience with these bites had given her confidence in her ability to handle copperhead encounters. At 2:15 p.m., while cleaning a copperhead enclosure, Pat was working with one of North America's most common venomous snakes. Copperheads are medium-sized pit vipers typically growing 2 to 3 feet in length, with distinctive hourglass-shaped crossbands across their copper-colored bodies that provide excellent camouflage in their natural leaf litter habitat. They're found throughout the eastern United States and are responsible for more venomous snake bites than any other North American species, primarily because of their wide distribution and tendency to freeze when threatened rather than flee. The copperhead's defensive strategy is based on camouflage rather than aggression. These snakes have evolved coloration and patterns that make them nearly invisible when lying motionless among fallen leaves and forest debris. When threatened, copperheads typically remain perfectly still, relying on their camouflage to avoid detection. Copperhead venom is considered relatively mild compared to other pit vipers like rattlesnakes or cottonmouths. Their venom is primarily hemotoxic, containing enzymes that break down blood cells and tissue, causing localized damage, swelling, and pain. However, fatalities from copperhead bites are extremely rare in healthy adults, with most bites resulting in localized symptoms that resolve with proper medical treatment. The species is also known for dry bites, defensive strikes where little or no venom is injected, which occur in approximately 25% of copperhead encounters. These snakes are ambush predators that rely on their excellent camouflage to remain hidden while waiting for prey. Their heat-sensing pit organs can detect warm-blooded animals from several feet away, allowing them to strike with remarkable accuracy even in complete darkness. Copperheads are generally docile and prefer to remain motionless when humans approach, relying on their camouflage rather than aggressive behavior. They typically strike only when directly threatened, stepped on, or handled. And even then, many strikes are defensive warnings rather than serious attempts to inject venom. Pat was bitten on the hand when she momentarily lost focus during a phone call with a colleague about an upcoming research project. The copperhead's defensive strike was typical for the species, a quick bite and immediate release, more of a warning than a serious attack. The bite itself seemed almost insignificant at first, 2 small puncture wounds that barely bled, typical of a copperhead's relatively small fangs. However, this bite triggered an unprecedented reaction that Dr. Williams had never experienced before. Within minutes of the bite, she began experiencing symptoms that had nothing to do with the snake's venom. Her throat began to tighten, her breathing became labored, and hives erupted across her skin in a pattern consistent with severe allergic reaction. Years of exposure to snake proteins through handling, feeding, and research activities had sensitized her immune system without her knowledge. The allergic reaction developed with terrifying speed, overwhelming her body's normal responses to the relatively mild copperhead venom. Her airways began to close as histamines flooded her system, while her blood pressure dropped precipitously as her cardiovascular system went into shock. The familiar symptoms of copperhead envenomation were completely overshadowed by the life-threatening allergic response. Dr. Williams recognized the signs of anaphylaxis immediately and managed to administer her EpiPen while calling 911. Her scientific training allowed her to understand what was happening to her body. But the dual crisis of envenomation and allergic reaction created a medical emergency that went far beyond standard treatment protocols. The copperhead's venom, while mild by pit viper standards, began causing tissue damage and localized bleeding at the bite site. Simultaneously, the allergic reaction attacked her respiratory and cardiovascular systems, creating a cascade of complications that her body couldn't manage. Her airways continued to constrict despite the epinephrine, while the venom's anticoagulant properties interfered with her body's ability to clot properly. Dr. Williams died en route to the hospital, becoming the first documented case of fatal anaphylaxis triggered by copperhead envenomation. Her death shocked the herpetological community and led to new recommendations for allergy testing among long-term reptile handlers. The tragedy revealed that even experienced professionals could develop hidden sensitivities to the animals they'd worked with safely for years. It was March 15, 2017, near Palu, central Sulawesi. The air was heavy with humidity, and the fading light gave the swampy lowlands a muted greenish haze. It was the kind of evening where the bush seemed still on the surface, yet alive with hidden movement. By nightfall, the shortcut Aegis Hartono had taken hundreds of times would become the scene of an encounter few could survive. Aegis, 49, had worked in palm oil plantations since his teens. He was known among his co-workers for moving quickly through tasks and avoiding unnecessary breaks. People said he disliked relying on others for rides and often boasted that decades of outdoor work had made him unfazed by the wildlife. The shortcut home along a narrow drainage path saved him nearly 20 minutes, and he had walked it for years despite thick vegetation and poorly drained sections that could flood ankle deep in the rainy season. That day, he had stayed late to finish clearing a section of overgrowth. A co-worker offered him a lift back to the village, but Aegis waved it off, saying the weather was clear. Villagers had spoken over the past week about a large snake sighted in the area. Some estimated it over 20 feet, but sightings were not unusual, and Aegis dismissed them as exaggerated. His machete hung at his side, more a tool than a weapon in his mind. The drainage path was a narrow strip of firm ground bordered by stagnant water and stands of nipa palm. The air smelled of decaying vegetation, and the clouds of mosquitoes clung to the shade. On one side, brush leaned over the path in heavy clusters. On the other, the canal's surface was broken only by occasional ripples. Dusk blurred the edges of the water and ground, making it difficult to see where one ended and the other began. Reticulated pythons in this region can reach lengths of over 25 feet, weigh over 200 pounds, with girth as thick as a grown man's thigh. They ambush from cover, striking with surprising speed for their size. Once coiled, they tighten with each breath their prey exhales, collapsing the chest until air can no longer enter. Large individuals are capable of subduing animals heavier than the human, and in rare cases, they've been recorded attempting to consume people whole. Two men walking parallel along a dirt road on the opposite side of the canal later said they heard a sharp splash, followed by a muffled yell. Looking toward the sound, they saw Aegis stumble backward, his machete swinging in jerks. The python had come from the brush beside the canal, striking high and wrapping its body around his torso. Its tail coiled low around his legs, pulling him off balance. Aegis tried to hack at the snake's body, but each swing was short and awkward. The coils locked tighter with each movement, compressing his ribs until his shouts turned into short, ragged gasps. One of the men ran down the embankment and grabbed the python's tail, attempting to pull it free, but the force of the snake's movements threw him sideways into the mud. The struggle lasted several minutes. Witnesses described the sound of Aegis's breathing stopping abruptly, his head dropping forward. The python held its grip even after he went still, adjusting the coil slightly to maintain pressure. When villagers arrived in response to the shouting, they brought more machetes and began hacking at the thick, patterned body. The snake did not release him until its head and several feet of its neck were severed. When the coils loosened, the python's intention became clear. It had already begun to position Aegis's head toward its mouth. Villagers pulled his body free before the swallowing attempt advanced. His face was smeared with mud, and his machete was still in his right hand. One man ran to the village to call for medical help, while others attempted chest compressions on the spot. Paramedics from the nearest clinic arrived nearly 30 minutes later, confirming he had no pulse. A brief autopsy performed the next day at the local health center reported multiple rib fractures, deep contusions around the chest and abdomen consistent with constriction, and signs of asphyxiation as the cause of death. Agus's funeral was held that afternoon in accordance with local Muslim customs, with the body washed, shrouded, and buried before sunset. Dozens of villagers attended, some still shaken by the attack, and prayers were offered for his family's safety. Local authorities documented the scene, measured the snake, and took statements from witnesses for their incident report. Wildlife officers disposed of the carcass and issued renewed warnings to plantation workers about avoiding isolated drainage paths after dusk. It was March 19, 2015 in Tampa, Florida. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to garages and dim backyards as dusk set in. Inside one suburban home, the sounds of teenagers talking and laughing filled the cluttered space. A reptile cage dominated one corner, and what began as a show of confidence would end in silence that no one present could forget. Marcus Rivera was 17, a high school junior with a restless energy and a fascination with reptiles. Known among friends for showing off unusual pets, he had gradually collected lizards, pythons, and finally a green anaconda he had purchased from a private breeder despite local restrictions. He nurtured a reputation as the one willing to handle what others would not, priding himself on strength and control. His parents had warned him repeatedly, but he brushed it off, convinced he had the knowledge to manage the animals. For Marcus, the anaconda was not just a pet, but proof of his daring. He wasn't careless, he fed and cleaned its enclosure regularly, but he also enjoyed the thrill of draping the heavy body over his shoulders, posing for photos and videos. That evening, he invited 3 classmates over, promising to show them how he could handle the 12-foot snake. They came expecting a spectacle. His decision to stage the display in the garage, away from parental oversight, was typical of the way he balanced discipline with recklessness. The garage was dim, a single overhead bulb casting shadows across boxes and tools. A faint, musky odor came from the enclosure where the snake shifted restlessly. The humid Florida air pressed into the closed space, making every movement feel heavier. The teenagers gathered close, their attention fixed on Marcus as he prepared. Green anacondas are the heaviest snakes in the world, reaching lengths over 20 feet in the wild. Though smaller in captivity, even a 12-foot individual is a muscular predator capable of exerting immense pressure. Their instinct is not aggression but constriction, responding quickly to movement and heat, tightening coils each time their prey exhales. Unlike pythons, anacondas rely on sheer mass, wrapping and holding until circulation and breathing cease. In confined spaces, the risk increases as there is no distance for a handler to maneuver. Previously, Marcus's parents had told him repeatedly to leave the snake in its enclosure when friends visited. Even online forums he frequented were filled with cautionary stories of constrictors turning deadly. Even his classmates hesitated, one asking quietly if it was safe. Marcus dismissed the concerns, pointing out that he had handled the snake many times before. For him, the demonstration was routine, another opportunity to show his control. He opened the enclosure and drew the snake out slowly, its patterned body sliding across the floor with a weight that took effort to manage. At first, the movement was playful. Marcus smiled as he hefted the bulk over his shoulders, the snake draping around his neck and chest. The others filmed from close range, capturing his steady stance and the snake's slow, deliberate movements. Then the animal shifted, coiling tighter across his torso. At first he laughed, adjusting his grip as though it were part of the show. But the coils kept sliding upward, circling his chest and throat. His expression changed, laughter giving way to a sharp intake of breath. His arms couldn't find leverage. He staggered backward, knees buckling under the weight. The muffled thud of his fall against the garage floor echoed as his friends shouted in confusion. He gasped, clawing at the muscular body pressed against his throat. Each exhale was met with another tightening. His face turned red, then darkened as the pressure built. The others tried to intervene, pulling at the coils, but the snake's body was immovable, its strength far beyond theirs. The sounds in the garage became a mix of his choking gasps and their frantic yelling. One friend pulled the pocket knife from his jeans and began jabbing at the snake's thick body, leaving only shadow cuts that oozed but did not deter it. Instead of loosening, the snake shifted again, circling tighter, driving its bulk across Marcus's ribs. One of his friends dialed 911. A loud crack rang out, the sound of bone giving way under pressure. His body convulsed briefly, heels scraping against the concrete before the motion slowed. The friends screamed his name, pulling, cutting, and shouting, but the snake did not release. By the time paramedics arrived, Marcus was motionless, his skin marked with deep bruises and abrasions where scales had torn into flesh. It took multiple responders to force the coils apart, prying and unwinding inch by inch until his body was freed. The snake lay subdued, and Marcus showed no pulse. Florida authorities seized the anaconda and emphasized the ongoing difficulties in enforcing exotic pet regulations. Local media reported briefly, focusing on the dangers of large constrictors in private homes, but coverage faded quickly. The funeral took place within the week, drawing classmates, teachers, and extended family. School counselors offered sessions for those who had witnessed the event, recognizing the trauma it left behind.
It was March 15, 2014, at Ranthambore National Park in Rajasthan, India. The air was cool and quiet after a very hot day. The camping area had turned off all its lights hours earlier, so everything was dark except for some moonlight. Inside one of the canvas tents, two travelers were sleeping. They didn't know that a snake had quietly crawled under the tent entrance. Claire Johnson was 26 years old and came from Melbourne, Australia. She worked as a graphic designer but had quit her job to travel around Asia for a whole year. She had been saving money for almost 2 years to pay for this trip. She wanted to see as much of the world as possible before going back to work full-time. Claire's friends back home knew her as someone who liked adventure, but was also careful. She always looked up information about the places she stayed, carried medical supplies with her, and wrote a detailed blog so her family could follow her travels. Visiting Ranthambore was something she had really wanted to do. She had always dreamed of taking photos of wild tigers. That day, she had gone on a safari tour and was excited because she got to see a female tiger near a waterhole, even though it was far away. She was staying at a cheap eco-camp outside the park gates. She was sharing a tent with Laura, a German student she had met on the train from Jaipur. The camp was basic but clean, with tents that had zippers and were built on raised wooden platforms. Claire was very neat about keeping their tent organized. Every night she would shake out her shoes and make sure the tent entrance was zipped up properly. That evening was cool for March, so she zipped the canvas door all the way closed before they went to bed, leaving only a small opening for fresh air. The camp was located next to dry grassland where thorny acacia trees and tall grass created areas of shade. At night, insects made buzzing and clicking sounds, and sometimes they could hear peacocks calling in the distance. The ground around the tents was hard dirt covered with leaves and small rocks. This kind of environment was perfect for small reptiles that hunted during the cool hours before sunrise. Spectacled cobras are common snakes in Rajasthan. You can recognize them by the circular pattern on the back of their hood when they spread it out. These snakes usually stay away from people, but in early morning they sometimes come into human areas looking for mice or rats to eat or seeking warmth. Adult cobras can grow up to 6 feet long and have poison that affects the nervous system. This poison is strong enough to kill a person within hours if they don't get proper medical treatment. Local tour guides always warn campers to check their bedding and shake out their clothes before sleeping, because snakes sometimes crawl inside without being noticed. That night, sometime after 4 in the morning, Lara woke up to a soft rustling sound near the bottom of the tent. She was still half asleep when she grabbed her phone and turned on its flashlight. The light beam showed something that made her freeze with fear. A spectacled cobra was coiled up just a few inches away from Claire's sleeping bag. The snake had its head raised slightly. Before Lara could do anything, Claire moved in her sleep and stretched out her leg. Her bare ankle touched the snake's body. The cobra bit her twice very quickly, putting both fangs into the soft skin just above her heel. The bites happened so fast that Lara almost didn't see what occurred until Claire suddenly moved and made a gasping sound. Lara screamed, which woke up everyone in the camp. Claire sat up and grabbed her ankle, where 2 small holes from the snake's teeth could be seen. Camp workers ran to their tent carrying flashlights. They could see the snake as it crawled out of the tent. Claire's breathing became fast and shallow, and people who saw her said her eyes looked strange and glassy. When she tried to stand up, her legs gave way as if they couldn't hold her up anymore. Her voice was very quiet when she said her legs felt like jelly before she fell back down onto her sleeping mat. The camp didn't have any anti-venom medicine to treat snake bites, so the staff put Claire in a jeep to drive her to the hospital. Lara went with her and pressed a scarf above the bite marks to try to slow down the spread of the poison through Claire's body. The drive to the nearest hospital took more than 40 minutes on bumpy roads. Halfway to the hospital, Claire stopped responding when people talked to her. Her skin became pale and felt cold and damp. When they finally reached the small rural clinic, the medical staff told them there was nothing they could do to save her. Claire's body was taken to Jaipur later that day. Her parents were contacted through the Australian embassy. They asked for her body to be cremated following the local customs. The camp management decided not to close down their business, but they hired a local snake expert who started giving weekly talks to new guests. These talks taught people how to check their tents properly and where to keep lights on at night to avoid problems with snakes. Lara eventually went back to Germany, but she later wrote a detailed story about what happened on a travel website. Her story warned other backpackers to always check their tents, bedding, and shoes when staying in areas where snakes might be present. This post was shared quietly for years as a serious reminder to travelers who thought sleeping close to nature was romantic without understanding the real dangers. This incident shows how important it is for travelers to take safety precautions seriously when staying in wilderness areas. Even experienced and careful travelers like Claire can face unexpected dangers when wild animals and humans share the same spaces. The tragedy serves as a reminder that proper preparation and awareness can be life-saving when traveling in remote natural areas.
March 8, 2016 dawned clear and warm in Phoenix, Arizona, with temperatures climbing toward a pleasant 78 degrees by evening. The desert air was dry and still, creating perfect conditions for the large constrictors that thrived in Marcus Chen's converted garage facility. Marcus Chen was preparing to feed his largest snake at his home-based breeding operation, taking advantage of the mild evening weather that kept his facility at optimal temperatures. The 31-year-old had spent 8 years specializing in large constrictors and was well known in the reptile community for producing exceptional reticulated pythons. Marcus lived alone and often worked with the snakes during evening hours, a practice that would prove fatal. The converted garage facility where Marcus housed his collection was a marvel of reptile husbandry engineering. Custom-built enclosures provided adequate space for his largest specimens, while sophisticated climate control systems maintained the tropical conditions these Southeast Asian natives required. Marcus had invested heavily in security systems, both to protect his valuable animals and to ensure they couldn't escape. Marcus had acquired his prize reticulated python through a specialized reptile dealer who imported Southeast Asian species for serious collectors. The snake had been legally imported as a juvenile and required special permits. At 7:20 p.m., Marcus approached the enclosure housing his most impressive specimen, an 18-foot, 140-pound female reticulated python he had raised from a hatchling over the past 6 years. These serpents are among nature's most efficient predators, capable of growing over 30 feet in length and weighing more than 250 pounds in the wild. Reticulated pythons are ambush hunters that kill through constriction, wrapping their muscular bodies around prey and applying pressure that can exceed 90 pounds per square inch. The reticulated python's hunting strategy is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering. These snakes possess incredibly sensitive heat-detecting organs that can locate warm-blooded prey from considerable distances. Their muscular bodies are perfectly designed for constriction, with hundreds of ribs providing anchor points for the powerful muscles that generate the crushing force. When constricting, these pythons don't crush their victims as commonly believed. Instead, they prevent breathing by tightening their coils each time the prey exhales, eventually causing cardiac arrest through oxygen deprivation. The process is remarkably efficient, with the snake able to detect the victim's heartbeat and breathing patterns through sensitive receptors along its body. Their incredible strength allows them to overpower animals as large as deer, wild boar, and even small crocodiles in their native Southeast Asia habitat. The python's heat-sensing abilities and lightning-fast reflexes make them nearly impossible to escape from once they've initiated an attack. Their strike speed can exceed 12 miles per hour, and their ability to accurately target warm-blooded animals in complete darkness makes them formidable predators. This particular female was in pre-shed condition, making her nearly blind and extremely defensive. Snakes preparing to shed their skin experience a condition called opaque or blue phase, where their eyes become clouded with a milky film and their vision is severely impaired. During this time, snakes become increasingly defensive and unpredictable, as their reduced vision makes them perceive any movement as a potential threat. Marcus made a critical decision that violated basic safety protocols. Instead of waiting for her to complete the shedding process or using proper feeding protocols from outside the enclosure, he entered her cage directly. This decision went against everything he had learned about large constrictor safety and contradicted the advice he regularly gave to other keepers. The moment Marcus stepped into the enclosure, the python struck defensively, grabbing his shoulder and immediately beginning to constrict. Her defensive response was instantaneous and overwhelming. 140 pounds of pure muscle wrapping around Marcus's torso with crushing force. The python's coils positioned themselves with deadly precision. One loop around his chest, another around his neck, effectively cutting off his ability to breathe or call for help. Marcus's phone was in his pocket, but the constricting pressure prevented him from reaching it or making any coordinated movements. The python's grip tightened with each of his attempts to struggle, her powerful muscles responding to his movements by increasing pressure. The snake's primitive brain had identified him as a threat to be neutralized, and her instincts demanded she maintain her grip until the perceived danger was eliminated. His neighbor found him the following evening when Marcus failed to answer repeated calls about a scheduled reptile pickup. The python had to be carefully removed by experienced animal control officers who understood the delicate process of unwrapping a constrictor without causing further harm. The incident became a rallying cry for enhanced safety protocols when working with large constrictors. This tragedy demonstrated the critical importance of never entering large constrictor enclosures and always having safety backup when working alone. Marcus's death served as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced keepers can make fatal errors in judgment, and that large constrictors, regardless of their normal temperament, remain powerful predators capable of killing humans. It was July 29, 2018, near Ocala, Florida. The late summer heat sat heavy over the neighborhood, the air thick with humidity and the constant buzz of cicadas. In the quiet stretch of the afternoon, the stillness of a backyard chicken coop would be broken by a decision that, once made, could not be undone. Robert Miller was 61, a retired auto mechanic who had spent most of his life working in repair shops around Marion County. He was known among friends and neighbors for his stubborn self-reliance and habit of dealing with wildlife on his own terms. For years, he had caught non-venomous snakes barehanded, often showing them off to his grandchildren before letting them go. It was a mix of bravado and habit, something he had done since he was young, and something he believed showed his control over the hazards of rural life. That day, Robert had been tending his small backyard coop, a dozen chickens scratching through the dirt for feed. He took pride in the coop, repairing it himself after storms and keeping it free from predators when he could. Snakes were not unusual visitors, drawn by eggs and small chicks. He rarely saw them as a threat to himself, only to the birds. The idea of calling animal control for a snake in his own yard felt unnecessary to him, something a capable man shouldn't need. The yard was lined with wire fencing and shaded by a few drooping oaks. The air smelled faintly of feed and damp soil. Beyond the coop, the grass grew patchy and uneven, the ground dotted with tire ruts from an old riding mower. A porch ran along the side of Robert's house, where his neighbor, Mark, sat in a weathered chair 40 feet away. In the bright Florida sun, a movement near the coop's nesting box caught Robert's attention. Eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are the largest rattlesnake species in North America, often exceeding 6 feet in length and weighing over 10 pounds. They carry potent hemotoxic venom capable of causing rapid tissue destruction, internal bleeding, and severe cardiovascular collapse. Though they typically avoid humans, they will stand their ground if threatened, relying on camouflage until cornered, then using their rattle as a final warning before striking. Mark saw the snake first and called out to Robert, telling him to use a stick or call for help. The diamond-shaped head and thick patterned body were unmistakable even from a distance. Robert brushed off the advice, stepping into the coop and positioning himself behind the reptile. The snake held still at first, relying on its coloration to blend against the dry grass and shadowed boards. Then, as Robert reached down, the rattle sounded, short, sharp bursts cutting through the humid air. Robert moved quickly, grabbing the snake just behind the head, his fingers clamping the thick neck. He lifted it up, turning toward the porch with a grin. The snake's body writhed violently, its coils twisting in the air, the heavy tail shaking. Mark shouted again for him to drop it, but Robert only adjusted his grip, shifting his weight slightly to keep balance on the uneven ground. The movement was small, almost invisible from the porch, but his grip slipped. The snake's neck flexed just long enough for its head to swing sideways. In one fast motion, the fang sank deep into Robert's left wrist, just above the joint. His hand jerked open and the snake fell, landing in the dust before sliding quickly toward the fence line. Robert stepped back but didn't retreat entirely, muttering that it wasn't serious. Mark saw the swelling begin within minutes. Robert's wrist reddened and puffed up, the skin stretched tight. He sat down heavily on the edge of the coop, breathing harder, his face damp with sweat. Mark called 911, keeping his eyes on Robert, who leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his shoulders rising and falling faster. By the time the paramedics arrived, 12 minutes later, Robert's skin had taken on a pale, clammy hue, and he was struggling to keep his head up. The paramedics worked quickly, loading him onto a stretcher and securing an oxygen mask. His blood pressure was already dangerously low, and his pulse was erratic. They began fluids and tried to keep him responsive, but his breathing slowed further on the short drive toward Ocala Regional Medical Center. Additionally, the bite struck a vein, accelerating the venom spread. He went into cardiac arrest before arrival and was pronounced dead minutes later. The county medical examiner noted 2 deep puncture wounds with surrounding tissue damage consistent with an eastern diamondback bite. The venom had caused rapid cardiovascular collapse, a severe reaction made worse by the location of the bite and the time to treatment. Robert's family was notified that evening, his wife and 2 daughters gathering quietly at the house. The funeral took place 3 days later, a small gathering under a canvas tent at the local cemetery. Only close relatives attended, along with a handful of neighbors. There were no speeches beyond a short prayer. County wildlife officers later issued a statement urging residents to avoid handling venomous snakes without proper equipment or training. It was December 1st, 2018 in Jakarta, Indonesia. The day had ended hot and thick with humidity, and inside a small residential neighborhood, a narrow house doubled as a reptile workshop. Within its concrete walls, glass tanks lined the room, their contents restless in the warm air. Among them was a snake unlike the others, larger, faster, and far more dangerous. By nightfall, its keeper would be dead. Rizky Hartono was 32 years old, known in Jakarta's small reptile trade circles as a determined breeder with a steady supply of both native and exotic species. He sold pythons, vipers, and other snakes to local collectors, making side income that supplemented his modest day job as a delivery driver. He had gained a reputation for being bold with his animals, often handling them bare-handed to prove he could. To his buyers, this gave him authority. To his family, it was reckless. Still, for Hartono, the snakes were his passion, and he believed they could bring him enough recognition to expand into a larger business. The centerpiece of his collection was a massive king cobra, nearly 12 feet long, purchased through informal channels. He saw it as proof he could handle the most respected and feared species in Southeast Asia. To him, demonstrating control of such a snake was both a selling point and a test of skill. The cobra lived in a reinforced glass enclosure in the corner of his breeding room. The king cobra, the longest venomous snake in the world, can reach over 18 feet in length and deliver enough neurotoxic venom in a single bite to kill an elephant. Its strike is sudden and precise, capable of hitting vital areas even when handled by experts. Unlike many snakes, cobras can deliver multiple strikes in rapid succession, and their venom attacks the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. Handling one without protective gear is a direct confrontation with a lethal predator. The house stood in a dense neighborhood, concrete alleys crowded with parked scooters, laundry lines strung between windows, and the smell of cooking oil heavy in the air. Inside Hartono's reptile room, the overhead bulb cast sharp shadows against the tanks, highlighting the dull scales of coiled snakes. When 2 customers arrived that evening, Hartono saw an opportunity to make an impression, deciding to bring the animal out directly rather than relying on hooks or tongs. His motivation was not carelessness but conviction that showing confidence with the cobra would close the sale. However, warnings had surrounded Hartono for years. Other breeders had told him not to free-handle venomous snakes. His own uncle had cautioned him that anti-venom was not always available in local clinics. That evening, one of the customers hesitated as Hartono unlatched the cobra's tank, suggesting they observe from behind the glass. Hartono brushed it off, insisting he had experience. His choice was less about arrogance than about trust in a routine that had not yet failed him. He slid open the glass and reached inside, gripping the thick body just behind the head. At first, the cobra stiffened, its hood flaring, tongue flicking rapidly as it read the air. Hartono raised it chest high, turning toward the two men to demonstrate the size and control. For a moment, it appeared manageable. Then, the cobra coiled abruptly in his hands, twisting with startling speed. Before Hartono could adjust, it struck his forearm, once, then again, sinking its fangs deep. Witnesses later described him freezing, his eyes wide as if trying to process the suddenness of the bite. His grip slackened, and he set the snake back into its enclosure, locking it with trembling fingers. He tried to dismiss the incident, insisting it wasn't serious. But within 10 minutes, his condition began to change. First dizziness and nausea, then vomiting into a bucket by the wall. His skin grew pale as he staggered, clutching the bitten arm. As the next 20 minutes passed, neurotoxic symptoms advanced. His speech slurred, his eyelids drooped, and his jaw muscles weakened. He dropped heavily to the floor. The customers, panicked, tried to support him, one rushing outside to hail a motorcycle taxi. They carried him into the street, his legs dragging, his eyes half-lidded as his breath turned shallow and irregular. By the time they reached a nearby clinic, his pulse was erratic, his body seizing as the neurotoxin advanced. The staff could do little. They had no Cobra anti-venom in stock. An ambulance was called to transfer him to a larger hospital across the city. During the ride, his breathing ceased, his chest heaving once before going still. Paramedics performed compressions, but by the time they arrived at the hospital, his heart had already stopped. Efforts to restart it failed. Back at the house, police sealed off the reptile room, photographing the enclosure and securing the live cobra for transfer to a government facility. The customers provided statements, explaining how quickly the strike had unfolded. Hartono's phone, left on the table, still displayed the open gallery where he had shown them pictures of previous sales just minutes before the attack. His funeral, held 2 days later, was modest. Family members, shaken but subdued, stood alongside a handful of reptile enthusiasts who had known him casually. Indonesian authorities released a statement afterward, reminding the public that handling venomous snakes without protective tools is illegal, and that private ownership of species like king cobras poses risks beyond the individual. No charges were filed against the family, and the story ran only in local outlets.
It was July 21st, 2016, at a palm tree farm near Palangkaraya in Indonesia. The morning was quiet and humid. The air felt heavy because it had rained the night before. By evening, something terrible would happen that would shock everyone who worked there. Reggie Peters was 32 years old and came from Britain. He worked as a farm advisor, helping to improve the water systems for growing palm trees. People knew him as a quiet man who was good at his job. He liked to walk around the farm by himself, writing down problems in a small notebook. Reggie had been working in Indonesia for 4 months. During this time, he took hundreds of photos of bugs, birds, and animals. He loved learning about all the different creatures that lived around the farm. The workers noticed that Reggie never scared away snakes or lizards. Instead, he would get down on his knees to watch them closely. On that day, Reggie went out to do his regular work. The rainy season was coming soon, so he needed to check the water ditches. If these ditches got blocked, the crops could flood. That morning, he packed his notebook, a measuring tape, and his phone to record notes. Around noon, 2 workers named Amir and Lutfi saw Reggie near a muddy ditch. He was kneeling down and writing in his notebook. They made jokes with him about the huge snakes that local people claimed to see near the water channels. Reggie laughed and said he would love to see one of these big snakes up close. The workers later said he didn't seem worried about their warnings at all. He thought their concerns were just old stories that weren't true. The palm farm was huge, stretching for miles. Rows of palm trees were separated by narrow water channels. The ground was soft and muddy from the recent rain, making some areas very slippery. Small flying Flying insects called dragonflies moved over the water, and mosquitoes filled the air. The only sounds were chainsaws cutting in the distance and frogs making low croaking noises from the ditches. The heat made everything feel still and heavy. Large snakes called reticulated pythons live in this area. They are some of the biggest snakes in the world. They can grow longer than 20 feet and weigh more than 200 pounds. These snakes hunt by hiding and waiting near water for animals like pigs or dogs to come close. Sometimes they even attack people, though this doesn't happen very often. In this part of Indonesia, the snakes have moved closer to where people work because their natural homes have been destroyed. Local people knew to stay away from these snakes, and some carried long knives for protection when working near water. By late afternoon, Reggie still hadn't come back to the camp. Amir started to worry and walked toward the last place where he had seen Reggie. The farm was almost silent, except for the constant buzzing of insects. That's when Amir saw something that made him freeze with fear. One of Reggie's boots was stuck in the mud near the water channel. A few feet away, there was an enormous python lying in a coil. The snake's middle section was hugely swollen, as if it had eaten a very large animal. Amir stood completely still, then started shouting for Lutfi and the other workers. Within a few minutes, 5 men were standing there, watching the snake as it slowly began moving toward the bushes. The swollen middle part dragged heavily on the ground, leaving a deep track in the mud. The workers grabbed sticks and long poles, trying to poke at the snake from far away. The python made a loud hissing sound and opened its mouth wide, showing its curved teeth. It coiled up to defend itself. The snake was massive, reaching about 15 feet long. None of the workers were brave enough to get close to it. The farm supervisor arrived and immediately called the local police. While they waited, the men kept watching the snake carefully. At one point, the swollen belly seemed to shift slightly, as if something inside had moved. One worker noticed a broad, uneven bulge pressing against the snake's skin, a shape too large and irregular to be a pig or dog. The men stepped back, horrified by what they were seeing. When night came quickly to the farm, they brought flashlights to keep watch. When the police arrived, they decided they had to kill the python. It took several minutes, and many people hitting the snake with long knives and poles before it finally stopped moving. The workers stood quietly as police and local villagers prepared to cut open the snake's belly. The process was slow and disturbing. As the knife cut through the pale belly scales, mud and fluid mixed together on the ground. Inside the snake was Reggie's body, curled up and covered in a layer of slime. His clothes were soaked and torn. One of the workers recorded what happened on his phone. The video started spreading through local messaging groups that night before being quietly removed. Reggie's notebook and phone were damaged by moisture, but were found near the edge of the water channel, covered in mud. His body was placed in a sealed coffin and taken to Palangkaraya before being flown back to Britain. The farm management quietly put up new warning signs near the water channels, telling workers not to travel alone. The following week, Reggie's cabin was cleaned out and his belongings were shipped home to his family.
April 22, 2017 brought perfect spring weather to San Antonio, Texas, with clear skies and mild temperatures in the mid-70s, creating ideal conditions for working with reptiles. The pleasant morning air made it comfortable to work in the facility without relying heavily on climate control systems. James Jimmy Rodriguez was photographing snakes at his commercial breeding facility, Lone Star Pythons, taking advantage of the excellent natural lighting that the clear morning provided. At 38, Jimmy ran one of Texas's largest ball python breeding operations and was respected throughout the reptile community for his genetic work with rare morphs. He had a history of minor heart problems, but managed them with medication and maintained an active lifestyle. Jimmy was known for his expertise with ball pythons, a species considered among the safest large snakes to handle due to their docile temperament. His facility housed hundreds of snakes, and he had been successfully breeding pythons for 12 years without serious incident. The commercial success of Lone Star Pythons had allowed Jimmy to expand his operation significantly over the years, growing from a hobby into a full-time business. At 6:30 a.m., Jimmy was photographing a valuable adult male ball python for online sales, part of his regular routine for marketing his animals to collectors worldwide. The 6-foot specimen represented the gentle nature that made ball pythons popular in the pet trade. Native to West and Central Africa, ball pythons are non-venomous constrictors that typically grow 3 to 5 feet in length. though exceptional specimens like this one can reach 6 feet. They're called ball pythons because of their tendency to curl into a tight ball when threatened, with their head protected in the center of their coiled body. Unlike their larger reticulated cousins, ball pythons are known for their calm demeanor and reluctance to bite. They're primarily nocturnal creatures that spend much of their time hiding in burrows or termite mounds in their native African habitat. When ball pythons do constrict, it's typically a gentle pressure compared to larger python species. However, they still possess the fundamental constricting instincts of all pythons. When they feel threatened or sense instability, they will wrap around whatever they perceive as secure and tighten their grip. Jimmy suddenly experienced crushing chest pain and shortness of breath, the unmistakable onset of a massive heart attack. The cardiac event struck without warning, sending waves of agony through his torso as his cardiovascular system began to fail. His breathing became labored and erratic as he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing with the pain and stress of the medical emergency. As Jimmy collapsed, the python was still draped around his neck and torso in the relaxed position typical of calm ball pythons during handling. The snake, sensing Jimmy's sudden distress through his rapid heartbeat, irregular breathing, and the stress hormones flooding his system, immediately shifted from its relaxed state to defensive mode. The python's response was purely instinctual. When ball pythons feel threatened or sense that their environment has become unstable, they seek security by wrapping around whatever seems most stable. Under normal circumstances, Jimmy could have easily removed the docile snake with minimal effort. However, Jimmy's weakened state from the cardiac arrest prevented him from performing even these simple movements. The combination of the heart attack and the snake's natural constricting response created a deadly situation that neither Jimmy nor the python could have anticipated. Jimmy's assistant found him 3 hours later when arriving for the morning shift. The snake was still wrapped around him, not from aggression but from defensive instinct triggered by Jimmy's medical emergency. Despite immediate medical attention, the combination of cardiac distress and restricted breathing had proven fatal. The incident led to new recommendations for buddy systems in reptile facilities and highlighted the importance of having immediate backup when working with any constricting species, regardless of temperament. The tragedy demonstrated that even the most docile snakes could become inadvertently dangerous when their handlers experience medical emergencies. It was October 4th, 2016, near Barcelos in the Brazilian state of the Amazonas. The river was calm under a heavy, humid sky, the water reflecting a dull green from the dense forest canopy. For those who knew its currents and depths, it was an ordinary day. For Joe Silva, the river he had worked on since boyhood would become the place he would not leave alive. Joe was 28, a fisherman like his father and grandfather. He was known among locals for his strong swimming and habit of entering the water even when others stayed ashore. He lived in a small wooden house near the docks with his wife and 2 children, and most of his income came from selling tuna carre and piranha to the market in Barcelos. Joe prided himself on being capable in the river, often telling others that the dangers were overstated, that people were too quick to let fear guide them. His work demanded long hours and constant adaptation to shifting river conditions. And in his mind, swimming was simply another skill he had mastered. This trip upriver had been routine, a 3-day run with 2 close friends, catching and cleaning fish to bring home before the next weather shift. That morning, they had filled the large cooler with their catch. While cleaning the fish at the muddy bank of a narrow channel, Joe had been teased for his reluctance to accept a dare from one of his friends: swim across the water and back. The channel wasn't wide, barely 30 yards. The channel itself was part of a floodplain network where large predators hunted. Green anacondas, the largest snakes in the Americas, can reach over 20 feet in length and weigh more than 200 pounds. They're ambush hunters, often lying motionless in shallow water, relying on camouflage to get close before striking. Their bite is used to secure prey before their coils constrict it. Attacks on humans are rare, but not unheard of in more remote stretches, especially during the dry season when prey grows scarce and water levels drop, forcing both fish and predators into tighter spaces. There had been warnings that week. Other fishermen mentioned seeing large ripples and brief flashes of dark scales in that channel. One man claimed a cow had gone missing near its banks just 2 weeks earlier. Joe had heard the talk but laughed it off, telling his friends he had swum there before without trouble. The dares at the cleaning site felt more like routine banter than a serious challenge. Without hesitation, he waded in, pushing through the surface vegetation until the muddy slope dropped away beneath his feet. The water was opaque, warm against his skin. He struck out with a strong breaststroke, keeping his head above the patches of floating grass. About halfway across, his right leg brushed something thick and unyielding. He kicked harder, assuming it was a submerged branch. The branch moved. In the next instant, something seized his upper arm with crushing force. His body jolted sideways, and he let out a sharp cry. From the bank, his friends saw a thick, dark body surge upward just enough for them to make out its size, thicker than a man's thigh. The snake's head broke the surface. Its jaws locked onto Joe's bicep. In the same motion, it wrapped its body around his torso, the coil sliding with a slow, purposeful grip. Joe's arms flailed above the water, then pressed desperately against the tightening loops. One of his friends grabbed a machete and ran into the water, shouting as he slashed toward the snake. But the anaconda began a slow roll, pulling Joe under. The rescuer got within a few feet, but couldn't see where to strike without risking hitting Joe. The water churned with bubbles and silt. Then, in a sudden lurch, both man and snake vanished beneath the surface. The rescuer surfaced seconds later, coughing and gasping, his hands empty. He waded back to the bank, scanning for movement, but the channel was calm again. Only the floating vegetation shifting slightly as if settling back into place. They shouted for help from passing boats and used the radio to alert local authorities. It took 15 minutes of searching before Joe's body was found, floating near the opposite bank. His skin was mottled with deep bruises across his chest and abdomen where the coils had constricted. The upper arm bore 2 deep arcs of puncture wounds, matching the placement of the snake's fangs. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, his limbs limp in the current. They pulled him ashore in silence, laying him out on the muddy grass. The cooler of fish was left behind as the men wrapped Joe in the tarp and brought him back downriver. His funeral took place the next morning in a small riverside chapel, attended by family, neighbors, and fellow fishermen. His wife sat beside the casket, silent except when speaking to their children. Local authorities issued a reminder to avoid secluded channels during the low water months, citing reduced prey availability and increased predator activity. The advice echoed through the fishing community for a short time before fading back into the background of the many other risks the river always carried. It was October 6, 2017 in rural Yorkshire, England. The air was damp and cool, mist drifting over quiet fields as evening settled in. In one outbuilding at the edge of a modest property, Fluorescent light flickered across glass tanks and metal racks. What had begun as a routine cleaning task would soon turn into a fatal encounter. Alan Brooke was 44 years old, a part-time zoo volunteer and longtime reptile enthusiast. By profession, he worked irregular jobs in construction, but his reputation among reptile keepers was built on his private collection of snakes. He had started with pythons in his 20s, gradually shifting toward venomous species as his confidence grew. Friends in reptile circles regarded him as disciplined, though not without a degree of pride in handling animals others avoided. His property housed several cobras, vipers, and rattlesnakes in carefully secured enclosures. For Brooke, the animals represented both fascination and mastery. He'd read extensively about their behavior, practiced with handling tools, and visited other collections to compare methods. His habits were meticulous: gloves, hooks, tongs, and a visor when working directly with the snakes. Yet familiarity had dulled his sense of risk. He invited fellow hobbyists over to observe, often to demonstrate technique. That Friday evening, he had asked a friend to watch as he cleaned the enclosure of a monocled cobra, an adult specimen nearly 5 feet long. The plan was simple: remove the animal temporarily, clean the tank, and return it. The monocled cobra is native to South and Southeast Asia. Recognizable by the circular marking on the back of its hood, it can reach lengths of 7 feet. Its venom is primarily neurotoxic, disrupting nerve signals and leading to paralysis. Symptoms can appear rapidly: drooping eyelids, slurred speech, difficulty breathing. Without specific antivenom, death may occur within hours, sometimes minutes depending on the dose. The species is considered unpredictable, prone to sudden defensive strikes if threatened or startled. Before the incident, warnings have been given many times. Colleagues at the zoo where Brooke volunteered had cautioned him against maintaining such species at home. Licensing rules were strict, requiring secure housing and protocols, but enforcement was light. His wife had asked him repeatedly to keep his collection smaller, pointing to the risks of a bite when no hospital nearby stocked the necessary antivenom. Even his visiting friend reminded them as they prepared that evening to keep the visor secured and never break concentration. Brooke acknowledged the risks, but believed his tools and experience were enough. He slid open the enclosure carefully, guiding the cobra out with a hook. The animal lifted its hood slightly, tongue flicking, but allowed itself to be placed into a holding tub. Brooke began cleaning, scraping away waste and replacing substrate while speaking casually about technique. Sweat gathered on his forehead under the visor. At one point he paused, raising the visor briefly to wipe his face with the back of his hand. His friend noted the lapse but said nothing, expecting the visor to drop back down. The strike was sudden. As Brooke leaned close to adjust the water dish, the cobra reared, head flattening into a hood, and struck forward. Its fangs punctured his left cheek just below the eye. He recoiled instantly, knocking the hook against the glass, and staggered back, clutching his face. Thin trails of blood mixed with saliva dripped onto the floor. His friend froze, then shouted for him to sit down. Within minutes, the symptoms began. Brooke's eyelids drooped, and his speech slurred as he tried to reassure himself aloud. His breathing grew shallow, each attempt more labored than the last. He dropped the visor and gloves, collapsing onto a chair as his muscles weakened. His friend dialed emergency services, his voice panicked, reporting the bite and naming the species. Operators instructed him to keep Brooke still and apply pressure immobilization, but there was little he could do. Brooke's hands trembled violently before his muscles began twitching, stiffening in uneven spasms as paralysis spread. By the time paramedics arrived, his skin was pale and clammy, his eyes unfocused. They began CPR after he lost consciousness, but no facility nearby carried the precise antivenom required for Monocled Cobra envenomation. He was rushed toward the nearest hospital, an oxygen mask pressed over his face, but the paralysis spread, shutting down his ability to breathe independently. Despite all measures, he was pronounced dead less than 2 hours after the bite. The aftermath was quiet. His body was released to his family within days. At his funeral, a small group gathered: relatives, a few colleagues from the zoo, and reptile enthusiasts who had known him through forums and meetings. Local authorities reviewed his permits and seized the venomous animals from the property. In Yorkshire, officials tightened monitoring of exotic animal licensing, though no new laws were passed.
It was June 10th, 2013, in Sweetwater, Texas. The fairground was extremely hot under a clear sky. Heat rose off the tarps and metal bleachers, turning what should have been a routine demonstration into a day where small mistakes would have serious consequences. Samuel "Sammy" Price was 38 years old and had been a volunteer snake handler at the annual Rattlesnake Roundup since he was a child. He did repair work around town and showed up every year to handle snakes for visitors. People respected him because he was steady and had years of practical experience. He taught new volunteers and preferred to show them hands-on rather than just talk about it. He believed that experience could help reduce danger. Local people trusted Sammy because he rarely rushed his work and would correct sloppy technique without making a big deal about it. This year, the festival had attracted a bigger crowd than usual, and the organizers had made the schedule tighter. Sammy had moved between snake pits all morning, answering questions from visitors and spending a lot of time in the sun. He had skipped eating a full breakfast to keep the demonstrations running smoothly, and he felt lightheaded. He thought this was just from the heat and being tired. His co-workers told him to rest and drink water, and he nodded in agreement but kept working. When someone asked him to do one more live demonstration that afternoon, he said yes, because he saw it as part of his responsibility. The roundup used shallow pits for displaying snakes. These pits were surrounded by temporary barriers, with a raised platform for the announcer and folding chairs for people to sit and watch. The smells of fried food and car exhaust mixed with dust in the air. There were shade cloths and water containers near the pits, but the layout was cramped and kept volunteers in the sun. People watching leaned against the fence with their phones held up high, recording every movement. The setup was designed so everyone could see clearly, but this reduced the space for handlers to move around and limited opportunities for both people and animals to cool down. Western diamondback rattlesnakes are strong pit vipers that are commonly 4 to 5 feet long. Their poison causes tissue damage and bleeding, and can trigger shock throughout the body if someone receives a large dose. Large adult snakes can strike with surprising reach. When under stress, a snake may twist in unexpected ways, changing how a handler is gripping it and exposing unprotected skin. Even skilled handlers can get bitten when a snake is already upset, or when heat and repeated handling increase its stress level. Earlier that day, organizers had warned volunteers about taking turns and limiting heavy snake handling during the hottest part of the day. A small accident in a morning demonstration had prompted them to formally remind everyone to take breaks and drink water. Medical personnel were standing by with IV fluids and anti-venom available on site. Sammy heard the instructions and agreed with them, but the crowd and the busy schedule drew him back to work. He took a heavy western diamondback snake from a colleague and stepped into the pit wearing a leather glove and carrying a snake hook. He lifted the snake using a practiced motion. For a moment, the crowd relaxed because Sammy's steady presence made onlookers feel calmer. Then the snake's body shifted under stress and twisted sharply. It lunged forward, and its fangs went through the soft tissue near Sammy's elbow. Pain shot through his arm. He signaled that he was okay, but his face became red, and sweat formed on his forehead. For several minutes, he kept talking to the crowd, but his breathing grew shallow and he asked for a chair. The bite area swelled quickly, and discoloration appeared, spreading down his forearm. Within minutes, the swelling moved past his elbow toward the shoulder, the skin darkening with mottled bruising as tissue damage progressed. Volunteers moved him to the first aid tent once it was clear he could no longer stand. Paramedics applied pressure to slow the spread of venom, started IV fluids, and pushed the first vials of antivenom. His breathing turned shallow, his skin cold and blotched with bruising. Despite fast treatment, his blood pressure collapsed, and his pulse faded. Witnesses later recalled the frantic attempts to keep him conscious, as medics called for an airlift that never came in time. Friends and fellow handlers organized training sessions after the event. They invited regional medics to review emergency procedures and practice drills. A younger relative of Sammy's began helping at the pits, learning to prioritize taking turns and staying hydrated over putting on a good show. The festival board documented the incident and created a checklist for demonstrations: maximum handling time, required breaks, and a fast evacuation plan to the nearest ambulance access point.